Please speak up. We are going to be recording this today. So if anyone objects to that, please speak now or hold peace. And so I'd like to introduce, I'm really glad to have Eric Bruning with us here today. He did all of his degrees at the University of Oklahoma. He did his PhD with Mike Biggerstaff. And so I guess without further ado, thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, and thanks, Anne and Marcus, for your hospitality during the visit this week. I also like to introduce my colleague Bruno Medino from Texas Tech. We were both here for the thunderstorm tracking workshop that GISS hosted earlier this week. So very nice to be here. My first time in Manhattan, and really enjoyed it. Lovely setting here. So great to meet you all. This is a talk that's largely based around the tracer field campaign that was
interrupt for one second here. Sabrina, could you mute, I guess, folks online? Okay, thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, no worries. So this is based around the tracer field campaign, which was a DOE initiated, and then lots of other folks, including an NSF field campaign, joined on to that effort to study thunderstorms in the Houston area. This is our team deploying with help of Timothy Logan, who runs the Houston Lightning Mapping Array, a few supplemental sensors to optimize the detection efficiency down in the Houston area. These are VHF band sensors that listen for the radiospherics that lightning makes when the individual steps of the lightning channel develop, and allows us to map the three-dimensional structure of lightning channels in the cloud. And it does that reliably and in real time over about a 100-kilometer range easily. So a great instrument, and it's really the foundation of a lot of the work that I do. Before I start talking about how we used lightning measurements alongside radar polarimetry in the tracer campaign, I'd like to do a brief introduction to the basics of electrification and lightning. If you're like me, you went through a meteorology program and you had maybe one lecture that taught you something about lightning. And so I'd like to try and connect that to some of the other cloud physics processes and the sort of state of our understanding. So we have on the right a growing cumulus cloud, and I've depicted a parcel that's rising through the storm there. That parcel incorporates properties of the environment, its thermodynamics and aerosol properties. And as that parcel rises through the storm, supercooled water is condensed at some rate. And eventually ice processes kick in, and when we reach the mixed phase zone, we nucleate ice crystals, and those are produced with some number concentration after further multiplication, and that results then in further growth with rhyming into graupel. And so along this parcel, you might imagine this mixed concentration of supercooled water content, graupel, and ice crystals. And as those ice crystals collide with graupel, charge is separated. That charging rate is enhanced by the presence of supercooled water. And laboratory studies, which are depicted, yeah, I'm not sure which one's going to be visible. Yeah. That probably will be okay.
Yeah.
So laboratory studies done in cloud physics chambers have, don't touch that way, have found that there tends to be a temperature at which the polarity of electrification to graupel is reversed. Notionally, that's around -15 C, but it's actually this two-dimensional curve, at least, of some combination of rhyming rate, so highly dependent on the supercooled water concentration, and the temperature. And so you can see I've got the parcel depicted on that rhyming rate temperature parameter space at warm temperatures and higher liquid water contents. Graupel charges positively, and the rebounding collision with an ice crystal gives the ice crystal a negative charge. And then in the cooler part of the cloud, after crossing the reversal line, there's negative charge gained by the graupel. And so this is sort of the fundamentals of how clouds electrify, and that means that electrification is sensitive to a lot of the same mixed phase cloud ice microphysical uncertainties that are shared by the wider cloud microphysics community.
Can I ask a question, Eric? The figure on the left, like the cloud looks upside down to me because supercooled water is more, common underneath, and the small ice crystals are more common, arguably above. And I think of the grapple as falling through the supercooled water. So I just wondered but is there a reason that it's in this order?
It's in that order because I wanted to attach the supercooled water and grapple together to the rhyming rate on the right.
I see. So
it's for convenience of the plot.
Yes. Okay, good. All right. Thank you.
You absolutely have described a cloud that the way it actually is. Yeah.
By the way, we have for many years at GISS, we like to interrupt our speakers with questions. So if anyone else wants to interrupt, just because if you have a question now, you might not understand the next 10 slides. And so please do interrupt. That goes for you online too. We can't actually see the chat, so please do just chime in. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was taught that the columns are very important, and there's this charge separation on the columns. Is habits don't matter for this, or?
Habits probably do matter. What we think actually matters at the ice surface is the relative diffusional growth rate of the ice surfaces as they're colliding. So the habit will then influence the diffusional growth rate of whichever face is actually colliding with the grapple particle. One of the reasons the supercooled water actually matters a lot is because at local to the surface of the grapple, it perturbs that diffusional growth rate quite dramatically. And
why does it charge? I mean, why is there an electron loss when these things happen?
That I am not super well prepared to answer. It has to do with, we think, the quasi-liquid layer on the ice surface. There's some charge bias in that.
Temperature differential. Is that part of it?
That probably plays a role. And then when the particles are colliding with one another, you're in that quasi-liquid layer tearing off some of that surface. And that's where the charge separation comes from. But down at the ion scale, I think it's maybe defects in the crystal lattice or other things that I don't really understand.
Because it's weird, right? I mean, like these are microphysical things, and they're affecting something at the nanoscale to make the charge change.
Yeah.
I think it's a temperature differential. I think there's some known, I don't remember the details now, but I thought it's the temperature differential because when you have that, you're growing, you're also, you're freezing that water, and so you're generating heat, and
Yeah.
Is it due to the polarity of the individual water molecules on the edge of the ice crystal or something? Because they are slightly.
And there's a certain amount of dissociation of them too, so we should, yeah.
Just seems very mysterious.
Within the liquid layer,
Yeah. Conveniently though, when you do work more at the macro scale, you can reliably reproduce this in labs, although if you throw the cloud out of balance by not allowing it to equilibrate fully before doing the experiment, colliding these ice crystals with a rhyming metal rod that you're measuring the charge on, you can actually get the reversal line to basically rotate 90 degrees and be primarily vertical instead of horizontal. So there's actually very interesting laboratory studies that still need to be done there to clarify our understanding. All right, so we have electrified a cloud, and this is the primary electrification mechanism in clouds. We think there are others, which I will not get into right now. But this is sufficient to explain the primary charge structure that we observe in clouds. After the microphysical charge separation, there's differential sedimentation of the different ice crystal habits from the rhymed particles that are precipitating. And so for the colder portion of the cloud charging pair depicted in panel D there, the grapple precipitates out and is separated from those ice crystals, turning microphysical charge separation into net charge separation in a volume of the cloud. Those charges are also carried on hydrometeors, so all of the other things that happen in clouds, like advection, and especially differential advection in a cloud that has some sort of wind shear. All of those properties result in the final distribution of the charge in the storm, and all of your meteorological intuition about how that process works is fully valid there. It's fully normal. The charge adds up to produce electric potential, just like mass adds up to produce gravitational potential, and so that then produces these regions of large potential in the cloud that are depicted on the right, that you can roughly think of as three polarities of charge stacked in the vertical, the normal tripolar structure of thunderstorms. And in the regions between the charge, or in the regions of large potential gradient, there's large electric fields, which is where lightning would initiate. All right, so then once lightning initiates in panel H there, that lightning is going to initiate at the region of large electric field. The channel develops bidirectionally from that initiation location, with a negative leader moving into positive charge and a positive leader moving down into negative charge. Sometimes, and this is often the case in storms, that there is an excess of negative charge in the middle portion of the cloud. And so that will then energetically bias that channel to head towards ground as a negative ground strike. There's simply not enough lower positive charge to neutralize things, so we conserve energy by dumping charge to the ground. It's also possible to flip storms over by modifying how the microscale electrification works, which we will not address here because all the storms in Houston look like this and this is sufficient. After lightning takes place, then there's free ions from the plasma as it's dissociated, and that those free ions reattach to the hydrometeors and neutralize some of the charge. Any further questions about the basics of electrification through to lightning? All right.
I guess I missed, so most cloud to ground is in Houston is positive?
Negative.
Negative, okay.
Negative polarity channel that's moved down into the positive charge, doesn't have enough to stop it, and goes
Okay, great,
all the way
thank
to
you.
ground. Yep.
And is that true for, the US in general, and storms in general, this is the most common?
Yeah, it's probably something like 80 or 90% globally is negative CGs. In the high plains of the US, it's tends to be positive CG dominated, or very few CGs at all. And that's it's due to thermodynamic effects. You can also, with aerosol effects, accomplish some of the same modification to the cloud liquid water content and cause the polarity of charging to work differently.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's connect this back to thunderstorm drafts and how those are driving the storm. Some nice work by Wiebke Dierling using multi-Doppler synthesis, looked at various measures of dropple volume, or the volume of significant updrafts in the storm in excess of 5 meters per second as a common threshold, and found that in general, more mixed phase ice flux means more lightning. So if your updraft gets stronger and there's more grapple produced, there's more collisions, and therefore the total flash rate then varies in response to that, and that makes good sense. We all expect a stronger storm has more lightning in it, and that's generally pretty well correlated, well above 0.7 on any of these log plots, but it is a log plot, and at the in different regions, this behavior can still be quite variable, and certainly for the weaker updrafts, you do see a lot more scatter there as well. But generally, updraft stronger means more lightning.
Can I ask a quick question about this ice mass flux? That's downward or upward? And
let's see.
It's precipitation ice mass flux must be downwards.
It's the product of the non-precipitation ice mass flux and the precipitation ice mass flux.
So the non-precipitation ice mass flux, is that Doppler and upward?
Yeah, so there's a multi-Doppler estimate of the vertical velocity and looking at the ice crystal flux going through that.
Okay, thanks.
Probably some sign math to multiply it.
Mhm.
All right. If we go to go to different storm modes, so here's your meteorological intuition again. I've shown you sort of a single cell or simple multicellular mode already. If we go to something like a mesoscale convective system, and specifically I'm showing the squall line form here, from many balloon soundings, Stolzenberg et al. Put together this conceptual model that has the same electrical structure in the convective core, of the normal tripolar charge. There's a screening layer that forms on the top of the cloud that is not so important for lightning. But then outside of strong updrafts, in precipitating downdraft regions, there's typically observed 6 layers of charge. And then out into the stratiform region, where there's a mesoscale updraft, there's yet another different charge structure that has more layers than the 3 layers in the cloud, or in the convective core. As and so as these storms develop, this extensive stratiform region becomes charged. The charge in those portions of the cloud that are more stratified are also more layered charge structures into which more extensive lightning discharges propagate, because the electric potential is not reversing as frequently. In convective cores, we observe lots of small lightning discharges because it's a turbulent region. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. If we look at supercells, those are now 3-dimensional storm structures. It's a rotating updraft, and so not only do you have the up and down, but you have a sort of left flank of the updraft and a forward flank of the updraft, and there can be different charge structures in these regions as well. So the upper left panel there, which is the left flank of the updraft, looks quite a bit like the non-convective regions of the MCS, but towards the forward flank, there's a completely different inverted polarity electrical structure that's produced in the forward flank of the supercell storm. So again, those complex hydrometeor trajectories and across the updraft variability in the supercooled water content results in even more complex charge distributions in those storms.
And these are all inferred from observations of lightning flashes.
That's correct, yes. Or electric field profiles on balloons flown through storms. The lightning mapping array does allow us to infer charge structure directly, and that's made it a lot easier to look at lots of places that we couldn't look at before because it's hard to put balloons in storms. I'm going to start on the right-hand side of this slide. If we now go to simulations, you can encode those laboratory experiments in a microphysical scheme. That's really only been done in the NSSL 2-moment scheme, but as I've shown you, that's not really hard to do. You're already doing rhyming rate, and so this could be done in any scheme. Ted Mansell did this for his PhD work and has maintained this scheme. And on the right-hand side are 125-meter LES simulations of a multicellular and a supercellular storm. As I mentioned on the previous slide, in updrafts, you can see very distinctly how complex the charge structure is. It looks like it's been mixed around by turbulence. And then as you head out towards the anvils to the right, especially in the supercell, you can see that becomes more layered. And again, then the lightning responds to that and produces much smaller lightning discharges in updraft regions. The electric potential is smoother, as it should be, because it's that's how differential equations work. And notice that there's also a much, because there's that simpler distribution, you can now recognize in the multicell that tripolar electrical structure and the multiple different regions of electrical structure in the supercell.
Eric, can I ask a question? Kind of a stupid question. So we went from charge to potential here.
Yes.
And in the previous plots, you had like plus and minus. Was that potential or charge?
So if you have a simple charge structure, charge and potential are basically the same thing. In reverse, it doesn't work that way. So, here you would tend to observe lightning channel polarities that would would make you think this is positive, negative, positive charge structure, but really you're probably seeing the potential structure and not the charge.
And the charge looks more like what you showed here.
And the charge probably looks more like that, yeah.
So another kind of a naive question, can either charge, or can they each be measured in situ?
Electric field, which is, sort of in between in its texture of these two, can be measured in situ. Particle charge has been measured in situ by Monty Bateman in the 90s, also on balloons, with a little canister that had charge flowing through it. Getting to a fully three-dimensional depiction of charge, that's super difficult to measure for a lot of obvious reasons. Potential, I don't think anyone has ever tried to measure.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So if we take all of the lightning discharges and add them up together, we then get what lightning tends to look like in a plan view, and these VHF lightning mapping systems allow us to make something that looks very much like a radar image. You can see flash extent density, which is the count of how many flashes passed through any given grid box, is shown in the top right corner there. Very high flash rates near the updraft. There's a bounded weak echo region in supercells, and that shows up as a lightning hole in supercells as well. Notice that the initiations of lightning flashes are biased toward the south end of the anvil, and then sort of surround the updraft. And you can also look at the average area of those flashes and see that they're near that updraft region and towards the forward flank near the inflow of the supercell. There's small average flash sizes. If you do an energetic scaling of those lightning flashes, so treat them as a capacitor and model the energy discharged by that capacitor, you can produce a flash energy spectrum that looks very similar to a thunderstorm's turbulence kinetic energy spectrum, and it even has this 5/3 power law. So that's derived from lightning mapping array data, and this was one of the first clues we had that there was a sound quantitative linkage between turbulence and charge structure in storms. Okay, because we're running this charging scheme in a model, we can also look at the individual terms in the charge tendency budget. I don't want to say too much more about this because I got a lot of other talk to get to, but I will point out that charge advection is as complex as you would think it is, given that it's turbulent. Whereas the lightning deposition basically mimics the charge sedimentation, and the texture of that is much less. And so that's sort of what we can peer into when we're using a model simulation of cloud electrification. I also had a PhD student who recently looked at compositing lightning initiation locations in the model. And by choosing a lightning initiation location, as you see on the right here, he was able to look at the perturbation flow around those lightning initiation locations and reproduced thermal bubble-like structures in the flow. So this is some more evidence that the turbulent eddy structure of clouds is influencing the deformation of these charge structures and probably locally enhancing the field inside thermal bubbles. So it's initiating typically in a balanced region of strain and rotation. So this was a sort of link that we proposed to DOE as part of the tracer campaign, that we would also look at this thermal bubble idea from Hernandez-Deckers and Sherwood, and look at the electrification in these thermal bubbles. So we're turning our attention now towards tracer. There's this well understood uncertainty in precipitation production in convection allowing models, and where the microphysical uncertainty in the precipitation parameterization is just as large as the aerosol uncertainty is. And so that's one of the motivations for the tracer campaign, to better constrain this. Some more of the Hernandez-Deckers et al. Work is shown on the right here with tracking thermal bubbles and looking at the microphysical constituents within those thermal bubbles, which are sort of the top 4 rows there. And as CCN increases, we observe impacts on the cloud microphysical species. Although curiously, the net impacts on sort of net energetic measures like latent heating and buoyancy and updraft speed do not seem to vary nearly as much. So this is one of the other mysteries that we want to explore with this tracer data set and some of the simulations that we're working on. There is an established understanding that, at least in model world, CCN can influence charging. Mansell and Ziegler showed that there tends to be a maximum in charging, which you can see here with these the blue contours in the middle column. A maximum in charging at a CCN of about 1,000, at least as parameterized in this model. There's also observational evidence of that from Hu et al. In the Houston area, and a more recent study by Sun et al. As well, using observations from satellite to look at inferring aerosol and its effects on lightning flash rate. So a lot of the same uncertainties that we have in cloud microphysics, again, are translating through to something that might be observable with lightning. All right, as we look at the tracer data set here, we're gonna make use of radar-based microphysical proxies to understand how updrafts are working in storms. So when you have an updraft pulse in a storm, warm rain, rain that's been formed on the warm rain process is lofted into the mixed phase zone. It can rapidly glaciate, freeze, and also drive electrification as it's doing so. And so this is a storm that I looked at in 2007, where the white dots that you see on these panels here show lightning initiation locations off to the side of a ZDR column, where oblate raindrops are being detected above the melting level. And shortly after that, they freeze, a KDP column forms, and then we see lightning discharges initiating. Because of these 3D lightning mapping systems, we can actually map the channel path around the microphysical measurements from the radar. And you can even see on the lower right corner there that lightning channel propagated around the signature of wet drops as they're falling through the cloud.
Eric, can I ask you to really quickly define ZDR and KDP for people who work on climate models?
Absolutely, yes. All right, so and Marcus can back me up on KDP when I inevitably get that wrong, but so ZDR is differential reflectivity. It's the ratio of the horizontal and vertical polarized reflectivity. So oblate raindrops make a big ZDR signal. Graupel particles are spherical. They'll have a near zero ZDR. KDP is a measure of is more proportional to the precipitation mass than ZDR is, and is further enhanced as a signal when there's a mixture of liquid and ice phases in the same region. And that's probably sufficient to describe that, I think.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So Anne and Marcus and others on this study from 2019 looked at the polarimetric signatures that I just described and lightning with some measurements prior to the tracer campaign, and found this signal again of the updraft pulse that's indicated by the ZDR column lofting these raindrops, followed by glaciation, and then the lightning flashes occurring. So this sort of conceptual model is what we're going to analyze in the tracer data set. As I mentioned, tracer is a field campaign that occurred in the Houston region. Its goals were to study the interactions and feedbacks among clouds, aerosols, pollutants, and the kinematic and thermodynamic environment in this very complex urban, rural, coastal, and continental, marine and continental environment, where we expect to see a sea breeze and where there's urban pollution sources and maybe clean marine environments and so forth. So we did that campaign in the summer of 2022. And on the right-hand side here, you can see flash extent density summarized for the entire campaign. Our NSF campaign was in June when there was no lightning, so that was great. And we still made good use of the data set, but we flew to Louisiana sometimes. You got aircraft, you got to use the hours. But then once you get into July and August, flash rates were a little bit more typical. And in all those later months, and even in June, you can see some evidence of greater flash rates along regions where you would expect the sea breeze to be initiating thunderstorms in the Houston
I
area.
can't help adding that the idea for this campaign was born here at GISS at a workshop of the ACPC group. And we were thinking that this is unique too for having a lightning mapping array, you know, and there aren't too many of them in the US, and having a strong aerosol differential, you know, at both clean and polluted conditions, as well as weak. You know, in a way, we kind of went because we thought this would be weakly forced conditions.
Yeah, and very favorable for isolated storms where you can sort of isolate this updraft pulse process.
Yeah, such as the paper that Marcus worked on that you just showed his. Yeah.
So yeah, it's very much tied to the ACPC effort, and all the big players in that world were advocating for their favorite measurements during this campaign. All right. In order to study these storms, we're doing this in a Lagrangian tracking way. We're going to use the operational weather service radars that are polarimetric to make sure that we capture all of the cells in the environment. We went out to 90 kilometers range and then tracked 15 dBz reflectivity features, and then required that they exceed 35 dBz during their lifetime so that we had a precipitating cloud of some sort, either warm rain or fully glaciated. And on the right-hand side here, you see some of the tracking results over the course of a whole day. You can even see at nighttime in the cool colors, there was more south to north flow, and then southeast to northwest flow later in the afternoon once the sun came up. So that tracking's working well. And the workshop earlier this week, we talked a lot about that. I'm going to show here an illustration of what we can do with this data set now that we've assembled it. I've pulled out one track, and this happened to be a storm that was also well tracked by one of the DOE radars that had some advanced control software on it that was tracking, targeting a specific cell for higher rate vertical and horizontal scans. And so you can see on the right-hand side there all of those different scans over the course of the hour of data shown here. And then this is the lightning mapping array data in the colors showing the lightning in this storm. The top panel is a time height view, and so you can see the individual lightning events taking place. And then during an updraft pulse after 2045, there's a burst of very small lightning discharges at the top of the updraft, and this is very commonly observed in lightning mapping arrays and all sorts of different storms. In the polarimetric data, as we follow this tracked storm, the cell area grows, of course. We first see a relatively large differential reflectivity signal, followed by a maximum in specific differential phase. And as that KDP signal is ramping up, we see the first lightning discharges, and then the maximum in flash rate corresponds with that maximum KDP signal. And then thereafter, the storm becomes more dominated by larger discharges again as the storm matures and eventually decays. So this sort of validates the conceptual model that we went into, into the campaign expecting, and we've been able to sort of reliably find that in these storms.
What is the duration of your, is that then this 30 minutes about, or?
It's actually about an hour.
Okay.
Yeah, so in the lightning data up top, it's 2020 to 2120.
Okay.
And in the track, it's 20 to 2110.
Okay. Is this a longer one then, or?
This is one of the better. This is Yeah, this is maybe one of the longer lived ones.
Yeah.
We need to do a histogram of the cell durations, actually.
Yeah,
That would be a
yeah.
good thing to do.
Thanks.
All right, so looking across all of the days on which we had well-tracked storms where there was good radar performance and where the real-time model simulations worked well, we picked out this relatively large list of golden days, and then characterized the storms based on whether they had or did not have these polarimetric columns observed in that tracked storm, and whether or not those storms had lightning. So in blue, those are basically warm rain dominated storms with no ZDR column, no lightning, no KDP column. In pink at the very top, all three are present. And then in orange is a ZDR column only, and in red is a ZDR and KDP column. And as the campaign went on, you might argue that there's a little bit of a trend towards more warm rain dominated storms. There's relatively few storms, except very early in the campaign, that had ZDR and KDP columns without producing lightning. So lightning's a relatively binary indicator of fully deep impulsive updrafts or none. And let's see, what else to say about this? Yeah, those track fractions did vary throughout the campaign, which is at least suggestive that we have observed some sort of thermodynamic and aerosol forcing that's controlling different proportions of cell behaviors on these days.
What is the evidence for the aerosol control?
I'm hypothesizing that there could be an aerosol control or a thermodynamic control, but something physically has to be controlling this distribution of properties.
Thanks.
Let's see. I'm going to say briefly about this this slide that if we look at some of the predictions that if we see a intense mixed phase, we should see lightning. That's borne out when we have a KDP, stronger KDP columns. I'm sorry, this is not even strength yet. The top row basically says that when lightning happened, there was 48% more lightning when a KDP column was present. And the 95th percentile flash rates were 3.6 times more when these polarimetric columns were present. So that's good. Although there's a lot of overlap in these distributions with and without KDP. Likewise, there's a lot of overlap in the distributions of storms with lightning and without lightning when both KDP and ZDR were observed. But you do see a shift in the medians towards more intense ZDR and KDP columns in those cases with lightning. The columns here are defined as a weighted, altitude-weighted sum of the value in excess of 1 dB or 0.75 degrees per kilometer for KDP. So taller and more intense column signatures have a larger value to the right in the lower four histograms. Okay, so we see the relationship we expected, but that relationship is quite scattered and overlaps and is not one-to-one. We also see that when we look at joint distributions of the polarimetric column measures and lightning. So in the middle row, I'll draw your attention there first. That's ZDR and KDP, and ZDR and correlation coefficient, which is kind of like KDP, but a little bit more sensitive to the phase mixture. ZDR and ρHV are very, very well correlated. ZDR and KDP are less well correlated, still 0.67 R value. And then if we go to the lightning relationships to the polarimetric column measures in the top row, there's a correlation there, 0.35 to 0.42 R value. But those distributions are not at all predictive of one another. And that would be a bad thing if my goal were to predict lightning from radar polarimetry, but I'm not trying to do forecasting here. I'm actually interested in the information content in the data set. And in that case, lightning then is informative in a way that we can't learn from the polarimetric radar data. So this makes me happy as a lightning scientist. I have a reason to go to field campaigns and provide extra information there. So one thing I'll hypothesize that might be a benefit of the lightning data set is that it's sensitive to the collision rates and not just the large hydrometeors that dominate the radar signals. And so I think that's something that could be explored for
So
further use.
is it possible that ice multiplication strength could be part of that?
I mean, I was just thinking also like the small ice particles are essentially unobservable in the radar. So, but that would affect the charging rates, presumably.
Yeah. So if you could somehow control a storm where you had weak and strong ice multiplication and everything else held constant, yeah, I would think that would show up in lightning. Yeah. We should test that in our model runs, actually. Yeah.
Turn the on-off process, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a great idea.
All right. I'm going to briefly talk about track fractions in the environment. So we looked at soundings and CCN data from the LaPorte site here. So the single arm site that's located on the east side of the urban environment and right next to Galveston Bay. So it experiences lots of different fluxes. For a quick look at whether we could compare environmental variability to the lightning variability and find a relationship, I calculated in training CAPE using the Peters et al. Method, using the 18 to 21Z mean sounding, so notionally pre-convective environments, and then the CCN measurement from the UHSAS instrument at the LaPorte site. You can see the variability in UHSAS in these 3-hour averages on the bottom there, and a column relative humidity profile from the soundings throughout the campaign. And when you do that, pretty much nothing. I'm comparing the track fractions here to ECAPE and the CCN concentration.
Can I ask a quick question? What is
Yeah.
what is the fraction part?
So think back to these stacked bar charts. Out of all of the tracks on the day, what fraction of the storm had one of these? What fraction of storms had this particular combination of polarimetric and lightning behavior?
I see. So it's the pink divided by the total.
Yeah.
Right?
So pink, I'm going to go down to blue just because it's easier to read the graph. 20% of the storms on the first day had no ZDR or KDP column and no lightning. So that's a track fraction of 0.2.
Okay. Okay. Great. And you have 5 classes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. So those 5 classes are the 5 classes at the top. At the top there, and then they're plotted as track fraction versus ECAPE for the representative value for that day. And you can look at all the statistical values, but it's obvious that there's no relationship there whatsoever for ECAPE, almost surprisingly.
I mean, it looks like, you have one outlier, but I mean, not the pink a little seem to be going up and to the right?
I mean, maybe it's a 0.3 R value and a 0.13 P value. So, a statistician would probably not agree there's a relationship there.
It might be worth looking at interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Likewise, looking at CCN, none of those relationships are really statistically significant except for ZDR lightning only storms, which is a relatively small portion of the data set. Also, maybe you could argue there's a breakpoint at 1,000 per cubic centimeter CCN concentration where behavior is pretty muddled at values below that. And then at large CCN concentrations, the nothing track fraction is larger. I don't fully understand that relationship yet, and but that's what's there if you do a single site comparison. What we think we need to do is probably go back and look at some of the mobile soundings that were done and compare the urban and rural sounding sites more carefully. pull in the aircraft measurements during the escape campaign where they existed, and really try and carefully attribute individual cells to environments to better understand this relationship. So that's my summer project. We are definitely almost out of time. I'm gonna not talk anything about this slide because it's repeating the same point.
We often go to the top of the hour, so I think you're
Okay,
another 10 minutes. It's fine.
okay. This is using mobile radars to see some of the same radar polarimetry during the escape campaign, and what cells were actually activated with lightning. This measurement I think is really worth talking about because we got exceptionally lucky at seeing measurements with the NCAR holodeck instrument about 90 seconds before the first lightning flash in the storm. So we actually have observed cloud droplet size distributions and ice crystal size distributions at just below the altitude where the lightning initiated and actually in the mixed phase portion of the cloud. So it's super lucky measurement. And there were subsequent samples of this storm later on as the aircraft was descending and the pilot was still brave enough to fly back through the thing. We appreciate the Canadians for doing things that sometimes the NCAR pilots, in my experience, have been very reluctant to do. NASA's pilots have been a little bit more adventurous in their DC-8, but in any case, this is a neat measurement. We're excited to look more at these measurements and compare them. I have a master's student right now, Sam Gardner, who's been looking at trying to pull all of these data sets together. So using the UHSAS measurements from the Convair aircraft, the vertically pointing radar from the Convair, which includes Doppler radar measurements, trying to do the Riemann accretion rate calculation from all of the microphysical measurements and cloud water content, and then plotting all the research radars, what they were doing in scanning, along with all the lightning mapping data. And I'm gonna play this just because it's fun to see things. Oh, there we go. Okay, so he's got this whole data set starting to get organized now, where we can watch the aircraft fly through the storm and see what's happening on all the instruments. And I believe this is done all interactively, so you can just kind of zoom in on the left plot and all the other things update. Actually wrangling this into a science study is another matter, but it's great for exploration.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay, one other highlight that I'm going to talk about is comparing these Houston measurements using the same methodologies to locate high shear quasi-linear convective systems in the southeast United States in the late winter. And so these are going to be multicellular storms. They're going to have a stratiform rain region. They're going to be sort of the opposite of the relatively boring storms that you see in Houston that are isolated and low shear. So again, the Houston track fractions on the left, the Southeast US track fractions on the right. And what you immediately notice is that there's a much larger proportion of storms that have ZDR or ZDR and KDP columns, but that do not produce lightning. And that's probably mostly an artifact of them being low CAPE situations, so 500 joule per kilogram. It's hard to get the drafts to go up into the mixed phase zone. When they do, there's also a much larger reservoir of charge and microphysical species that is just present there that those drafts are interacting with immediately. And so that really changes the dynamics of these storms and how these track fractions show up. And I think that's gives us some confidence that these track fractions are a useful way of characterizing the environment on a given day, because they're capturing reasonable and large differences in the character of the drafts without really having to try and do a multi-Doppler retrieval or something like that. Again, lightning is a helpful discriminator here. Without lightning, you would probably see this discrimination between ZDR and KDP with and without lightning, because you don't have the information. that got messed up in the PowerPoint export. So imagine shifting those ovals up 2 rows. But we've also been looking at the timing of the peaks in ZDR and KDP. And we see that generally the ZDR peak is, precedes the other signals by about 10 to 15 minutes. And that that ZDR KDP peak is, 8 or 18 minutes apart. And that in the Southeast US, that signal is a little bit more prompt. So only 8 minutes, which makes sense. There's a lot of cloud there already. And so you put an updraft there and you see the microphysical response much more immediately. Also, the KDP lightning peaks are pretty much aligned with each other. In the median, there's 0 lag between those two things. And so that's also a helpful signal that KDP and lightning signal really does go together pretty tightly. I think that's what I wanted to say there. I want to close by mentioning this lightning modeling grand challenge that we've just started. We held a workshop earlier this month. This was instigated by Sandia National Lab, who has a national security interest in monitoring lightning. It's their background signal. And they care very much about identifying whether that background signal is lightning or something else that's exploding. And so they've taken an interest in having an end-to-end physical model of lightning processes from the meteorology all the way through to a forward model of observations. So we had 60 experts at this workshop, and we'll be having we've proposed an AGU and AMS town hall for the upcoming meetings to sort of share the roadmap that we'll be writing this summer with the community. This is sort of a notional idea of what this end-to-end model might look like. We think there's sufficient components in predicting cloud electrification from the microphysics, being able to produce lightning discharges and realistic plasma processes along those lightning discharges, and then scattering that light produced by the plasma through the cloud to an optical observing system, or using the currents that flow along that channel to produce radio frequency emissions that could be observed in different bands. And so lots of these pieces are sufficiently mature that we think it's a good time to try and stitch these components together and see what happens when you try and make that end-to-end prediction. It's a grand challenge. It's a decadal kind of effort. It's going to be terrible the first time we do it. But in doing that, I think we're going to learn where we have shortcomings and also get some communities that probably should talk more, talking with each other about how to do this. So we've had a lot of agency interest. NASA and NOAA have in various portions been supportive. There's supportive things in the DOE and NSA world as well, and we'll be visiting with NSF next week about this as well.
Have you gotten much for the climate modeling community? Do you have a sense? Is this kind of a tuning knob for them? How is the lightning? Is anyone participating in this group from that community? Or
we had Kristen Rasmussen as one of our speakers, which is climate adjacent from the sort of updraft, the NASA Incas project sort of idea. So the updraft dynamics and the variability of meteorology from region to region, some of that ties into climate. Some of the lightning Knox people were involved as well. So Bill Bruning and his PhD student Patrick McFarland gave a presentation. In terms of the clouds and climate and the deep convection and climate community, I think that's an opportunity to get engaged. And if there is interest, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to mention it here, because I think lightning is a helpful sort of global way of observing deep mixed phase microphysical processes. So I wanted to kind of close actually, and we can talk more about the grand challenge in a minute, but I think this illustrates the question you just asked. Let's think about lightning and convective processes in the climate system. This is a normal thermal infrared image that I grabbed of storms last night as I was finalizing my talk. And I want to sort of run this thought experiment. If you look at this, where would you say the convective cores are? And where would you say the precipitating stratiform regions are? And where are the thin non-precipitating anvils or the even thinner wispy anvils? Some of that's obvious, some of that's maybe not so obvious. We just had the workshop this past week here, you know, where a lot of these themes were prevalent, and I was really struck by how much opportunity there is to include lightning data sets in that convective stratiform discrimination task. There is now a geostationary lightning mapper and that goes east and west positions. The Europeans just launched one, and we can make these same flash extent density maps with those. So I trust you've all sort of stared at this for long enough and have sort of imagined where convective cores are. So there's where the convective cores are from a lightning perspective. I would wager that's probably a more compact area than you would tend to classify using just a satellite-based perspective. You can also see in the large convective complex in the lower right here, this one actually did have an electrified stratiform region.
Yeah, I was surprised not to see more of that.
Yeah, but you do see some of those here.
Yeah, but yeah, not.
But it doesn't go out very far.
No.
It only goes out to about there.
Uh-huh.
There's also all sorts of lightning in these cores, infrequently, but at relatively warm brightness temperatures. And yeah.
Sorry, could you say again, what the scaling is with where the flashes occur with respect to these convective updraft regions? Like, is it kind of, I guess I'm aware that kind of like hail kind of falls outside and lightning and hail are not necessarily correlated with one another, but hail falls outside of the convective updraft regions. The lightning flashes, where do they fall, or where do they occur with respect to updraft regions?
Yeah, so the tall, deep, heavily precipitating convective cores, both the updraft and the adjacent hail-sized downdrafts, those are relatively compact, and those are these the sort of brightest spots in the smallest areas that you see here. And then attached to that is going to be a stratified cloud where, you know, the microphysical species that more slowly precipitate are detrained. And if those are sufficiently electrified, then you'll get a lightning discharge to go through those. And so that's what's being indicated outside the convective cores that are real bright in this image.
Like at smaller scales, you do get like that bounded weak echo for very intense updrafts where there's sort of nothing. And then it's to the side of that you have all the charging, but that's like on the, I don't know, 100-meter scale or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. And in supercells, that's a relatively rare convective mode to even, you know, have that intense of an updraft.
Any pressing questions before we close the recording? And Eric will be with us this afternoon. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious, like, from like a energy like budget perspective, like how big is like lightning as a term in comparison to the magnitude of like the energy of the system?
Yeah, that's a question that goes all the way back to the Thunderstorm project. Those famous studies. There's a paper that looked at that, and it's less than 10%.
It's like a good amount.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a measurable amount. That's the number they came up with then. I think it would be interesting to revisit that with modern measurements, actually.
Right, totally.
Yeah.
I have one question, but you can go ahead and stop the recording.
Okay, good idea. So thanks so much, Eric. Sabrina, if we can end the recording, we'll end the meeting now. Thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you all.
I think we can.